Are we good to start? Okay. Good evening to all, and thank you for joining the Dasra Philanthropy Week Virtual Impact Forum and this session called Bringing to Light the Polycrisis with a focus on philanthropic action in India. I am Anushka Dias from the Research and Insights team at Dasra and will be your moderator for this panel discussion today. Dasra has been working on a research report that aims to shed light on the polycrisis in India and build new pathways for philanthropic action. This research effort is founded and granted by Omega Resilience Award, and we would like to thank them for their continued support in producing this crucial knowledge. Before I introduce the theme of our session and our esteemed panelists, I would first like to engage the audience with a quick peek. This is just to get a sense check from everybody in the room on where we are at in our understanding of the term polycrisis. Do we have the poll ready? Yeah, so the first question is, are you familiar with the term polycrisis? And the second question is, if yes, do you see the polycrisis as critical to driving change on the ground? Give it a minute to gather all our answers. Okay. So very interesting. About It keeps fluctuating, but about 65% people have heard the term polycrisis before. So this is a very, I think, well-versed audience that we have today. And 67% people say yes, they do see the polycrisis as critical to driving change on the ground. So this is a well-informed and also optimistic audience, which is good news. Um, so thank you for that. Moving forward to the theme of our panel discussion today, I'll just take a few minutes to also introduce the term. So the term polycrisis is a relatively new term and became widely popularized only a year ago. It was the World Economic Forum that invoked the term in early 2023 as a response to the cascading crisis occurring all at once on a global scale. Marked by the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, shortage of natural resources, fragmented institutions, and deteriorating public health, polycrisis is a term that puts into perspective the looming threat to stability of interconnected systems and institutions, seen now at a more accelerated pace than ever before. The more concerning aspect, especially for countries of the global majority, is a future that places marginalized communities on the fault lines of economic shock and unprecedented risk, pushing them further into vulnerability. My guess is that most of us here today interested in attending this session are already led by an intuitive understanding or a meaning attached to the term polycrisis. We've perhaps felt this in our own personal experiences or might have observed how its effects play out in our work within social impact or interaction with communities. As this conversation today unfolds, the idea of this discussion is to hold space to think through India's paradoxical position as a growing economic powerhouse that hosts the majority population on the brink of vulnerability. And not wanting to be the bearer of only bad news, we will also bring to light the new opportunities that are poised to carry communities from strength to strength, build for social innovation that tackle systemic barriers, and consider how philanthropy can harness its capital towards building resilient futures for all. Without further ado, I will now introduce our speakers. Today we have with us Gagan Sethi, founder and vice chairperson of Jan Vikas and Center for Social Justice. Gaganji is a recognized leader in policy formulation, facilitating development projects and advocacy for minority rights. He is the founder of 10 development organizations working on areas of human and institutional development, women empowerment, minority and Dalit rights, as well as youth employment and education. Then we have with us Manisha Gupta, who is the founder of Startup, an incubator, impact accelerator, and leadership springboard for social entrepreneurs. Under her leadership, Startup has seeded and scaled more than 100 social ventures across 21 states. It has trained 400 plus early stage social entrepreneurs and rural businesswomen to emerge as leaders and change makers of their region. We also have with us Kumar Sambhav. Sambhav is a social entrepreneur, journalist, and researcher. He is the founder of Land Conflict Watch, an interdisciplinary agency that conducts research on natural resources. He's also the India research lead at Princeton University's Digital Witness Lab that conducts research on impact of digital technologies on society. Nandini Velo is a wildlife biologist and has a PhD from James Cook University, Australia. She's worked at the Earth Institute in Columbia University and is the founder of Canopy Collective, which is a multidisciplinary group of scientists, storytellers, practitioners dedicated to bridging the gap between science, art, research, and action for wildlife conservation in Northeast India. And finally, we have with us Luis Miranda, who is the co-founder of Indian School of Public Policy. He's also the chairman of Center for Civil Society and Coro, a grassroots-owned organization that develops community-based approaches to improving the lives of India's most marginalized and oppressed. Thank you so much for joining us today, speakers. A quick note on the session structure before we get into the interesting bits. The session will be divided into two main parts. In the first part, we go around the room and ask each of the speakers to introduce their perspectives on how they see the polycrisis as impacting communities in India. And they'll take us through instances of resilience, innovation, and helpful ways of thinking through this. And in the second part, we will move into a discussion about the steps to be taken forward. Where can philanthropy and civil society really play a critical
Your voice is gone.
Hello?
Yeah, now you're back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
Sorry. How much, where did I last drop off?
6 seconds.
Sorry, did I explain the note on
Yeah.
the session
Go
structure?
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so first I would like to bring Gaganji to open up with his perspective. So Gaganji, as a stalwart and someone who's steeped in the sector for over 30 years and worked across policy, social justice, capacity building, and advocacy, I would like to ask you, how have you seen the polycrisis affect communities in India in the past, and how do you see this impacting communities today?
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Anushka. I'm audible, I assume.
Yes, yes.
So other than the definition, which, what you already said, so I'm not going into it. The question is, how does the whole India scene see it today? And I thought the best metaphor would be Sita and Akbar. Sita and Akbar are the two lions who were mated, and because of what they did, the bureaucrat was punished, and the courts also intervened. I think this is the crisis, that Sita and Akbar, two lions, cannot be named, and that is the extent to which this polycrisis is hitting the mind of people. Next slide is just the mapping of the real-time crisis. Go to the next slide. And I think it's something you all work with. You all work with this. You work with involuntary migration, supply chain, all around basically what I would say the disaster from the environmental point of view. So that being central, everything. But I think if I put it, what therefore has it done? 3 SDGs, I think, have failed us. Reduced inequality, SDG 10. Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, failed us, whether it's Ukraine, whether now Palestine. And I think the goal 17 has doubly failed us. That is partnership for all goals. And I think you can see its cascade effect in every country. So there's a global position on these failures. And therefore, I think globalization is a failed experiment. And therefore, if you see all these institutions, um, the UN has failed us. And therefore, you're seeing other new power blocks coming up and talking to each other. That's exactly happening within the country also. It's happening in rural areas also. It's happening in communities also. They are breaking up. Villages are breaking up. The next slide, therefore, is how does it happen? We are seeing pauperization, largely because of health and deaths happening. And therefore, we are supposed to be providing free food. You can look at it as a political largesse, but I think people are realizing it's a very, very precarious situation on the ground, those who see it. We are a hungry country. We need to recognize why are we hungry. You can see what the farmers are doing today on the streets and how are they being dealt with. These are polarities which we are seeing, and the whole country is divided on several issues. There is no one point where we come together. We are facing climate disasters every day. And I think the macho spending on defense and security is what is highlighted by the media rather than on development. On the real micro level, learning levels are going down. In Gujarat alone, there are 1,600 single teacher schools. What kind of inequality in education for children is happening? On the other hand, some of us who work on rain-fed agriculture, revitalizing, we see that farmers have handled their food situation better. And I think the big piece is that civil society has been NGOized. Even when I was, putting into admitting myself in this room, I was called an NGO. And I said, I won't be an NGO. I'm not a non-government organization. I belong to civil society. And I think it was civil society in the pandemic and even today, which keeps the communities together, whether it's through art, culture, whether it is through innovations. And I think we should stop applying the management principles of efficiency on them. We need to be in that educational space. We are educators. We need to help people into reflective practice. And unless we don't do that, and the last slide, let's agree that our core task is to reduce vulnerability. We have to, again, look at citizenship rights in a different way. I think just the mere income increase is what everybody looking at our role is not. It is necessary, but it's not the panacea. We are at the moment facing the full brunt of culture of violence, intolerance, and the hegemonic demonizing of the other. And therefore, we don't have a cultural narrative. And that's why we need partnership, practice, and policy between the sectors. I mean, you know who the vulnerable are. Are we really working with them and looking at their reflective practice, how they can reimagine things? And therefore, some sort of insightful engagement is needed. We need to build champions on the ground. We don't need champions out there. We have enough champions at that level. And therefore, we need to relook at our economics. And there is a discussion on what compassionate economics is. And that is not an avaricious and toxic economic model, because I think that's the core root cause of what's happening. I'll stop here. I think this is something we should really carefully look at.
Thank you, Gaganji. And you mentioned inequality as one of the deep-rooted causes that create this sort of cascading effect, which is where we've arrived at today. So, if I can ask you, how are the ways you've perceived communities building resilience to these effects?
Anushka, I still, I'm part of Dasra, we're on a social compact. And I go and meet workers who for 10 years have been still earning 15,000 rupees per month without an increase. There's no social security. I think where is the public expenditure going? There is money which is not being utilized. I think we need to reimagine our economics. That's really the thing. It's about our policy frameworks. And Luis is there. I think he can be able to tell us much more when it comes to him. But unfortunately, we have this one man knows it all, feudal idea of governance, which is crazy. Solutions are not to be found in Delhi. They are to be found with communities. And wherever that has been tried, we have succeeded. And I can give you many examples when communities come together, they can even deal with these toxic identity issues. And therefore, civil society's job is to build champions on the ground. And those who are building those are building resilience.
Thank you, Gaganji. So now I would like to bring in Manisha and shift gears a little bit and ask you, Manisha, as someone who has worked in the social entrepreneurship landscape and in leadership development, and also with the Omega Resilience Fellows, I would like to know from you, how do you see the polycrisis in this global narrative? Where do you see India and how the polycrisis is impacting India today? And what do you see as opportunities on the horizon for us to build more resilient futures? What does that look like?
Thanks, Anushka. I'm actually going to build on Gagan Bhai's points and speak a little more specifically about our own experience of designing a fellowship program that is centered on the theme of polycrisis. Since fellowships are a format of philanthropy, that might be relevant to your question. So actually, 2 years back, we were invited by Commonweal, which is an organization in the US, to design, curate, and lead the Omega Resilience Awards Fellowship in India, which is called the Aura India Fellowship. And quite honestly, at that point of time, when we really heard the term polycrisis, it was a new term for us. But, while the word was new, the phenomenon had been just really playing out as Gagan Bhai, has so evocatively laid out. But the term polycrisis at that point of time really gave us a vocabulary and a new grammar to start to sort of, make meaning of the overall overwhelm that we were seeing between all stakeholders in civil society, in government, in business, but most of all in grassroots communities. So we really started to kind of study how polycrisis is playing out. And we recognized a couple of interesting things. First, in the Indian context, but I'm sure it would be true elsewhere, what happens with polycrisis is multiple stressors interact with each other and then they combust, and almost in terms of like a chemical reaction, they go on to create a new set of crises, which is unpredictable, it's non-linear, it's not comprehensible. And so, we were doing conversations where we were hearing communities on the ground really talk about how the breakdown of their farm, forest, and food systems was leading to a breakdown of their personhood and well-being. We were hearing conversations where folks were saying, climate crisis is actually a child's rights crisis. And overall, nutritional vulnerability, Gagan Bhai spoke about how we are a hungry nation. Overall, the whole question of nutritional vulnerability was actually being asked by livelihoods groups. So intersectionality had really become a lens. And right off the bat, when we started to design this program, we said, we really need to take an intersectional lens. But very quickly, we said, that's not going to be enough. We would have to get to intersectionality version 2.0, right? Like next level. And what would that really mean for us? So, it really meant for us that we change our mindset and we kind of really start to look at responses to polycrisis in a very different way. There were a couple of things we did. Gagan Bhai has sort of really spoken about, the dismal scenario we are in. But for us to even respond and to design a fellowship program, we had to kind of really move away from doom and dystopia to really see where can we find hope for us as designers of a program. And we then kind of, started to detach ourselves from the dominant discourses in the development sector, and started to really look at what is happening in the underfunded, not so visible domains of work. And we started to really look for unusual change makers who are a little off the mainstream, the off grid, of mainstream development. What is it that they were doing? And also from a team perspective, we had to really build an unusual eclectic team that would be on lines of intersectionality version 2.0. So our team members, our Aura advisory committee that we created comprises people from spaces like arts, community arts practice, citizen data, civic tech. We have a compost wali, India known compost wali, on our advisory board. So we had to bring together unusual people in our team and in our domains to really design the program. And we came together and sort of really laid out a few design principles of how we can respond to polycrisis. And I'm just going to share one or two, a couple of those design principles before I stop. One, we said that a program that really responds to polycrisis has to be a program that focuses completely on the ground. It privileges, it honors, it celebrates community storytellers, community knowledge creators, folks who are enabling citizen data, folks who are really creating new knowledge. And we said the real experts, as Gagan Bhai also said, are really communities on the ground. And so we had to then, kind of start to look for unusual enablers of communities and partners of communities who were by design and determinedly sector agnostic. Because, polycrisis is sector agnostic, right? So, I mean, if you speak to Nandini and Kumar, who are Aura India fellows here, and just ask them which sector do you belong to, they'll take a whole day to think about the question, and then they'll come back the next day to say none of the above or all the sectors, So we were sort of really looking at, visionary change makers like them. The other principle that we really had was hyperlocal was going to be the new frontier of innovation and change. And that's what Gagan Bhai has also said, right? It's really going to be communities. Because, polycrisis is really site-specific. So, how a bunch of stresses work out in Delhi manifest, the same bunch of stressors will manifest very differently in Corbett National Park, which is 200 kilometers away from us, right? I'm joining in from Delhi. So hyperlocal was really going to be the lab of innovation. So we said, the Aura Fellowship must be designed to respond to hyperlocal communities, and the other thing that we were also very clear is that the Aura India Fellows would be working at hyperlocal levels, but from a systems lens, right? And finally, we also said that this fellowship will focus, celebrate, find, fund unusual players like conservation scientists, like journalists, like musicians, like authors, like folks who are sort of really turning streets of India into streets of resilience. So we were really like data journalists. So we were sort of really going to create unusual players who could um, who could create, partner with communities and create circles of collaboration, community-based alliances, which would be regenerative and healing. Because you know what, in the whole context of the polycrisis, what we are really seeing is that it's community resilience, and it is really people who are working at the intersections of data, design, and grassroots practices to bring up new knowledge, new narratives, which will have to be by the community and led by community. So that was just, you know, a way in which we've designed the Aura India Fellowship, which is sort of really a program, and I think the first of its kind in the country that's responding to polycrisis. So yeah, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Manisha. It's very fascinating to hear from this perspective, especially because polycrisis is such a term that's a very seen as a very top-down kind of term. And when you talk about the Aura Fellowship and about, like you just said, unusual suspects and bringing a truly sector agnostic kind of lens, we can see um, that being embodied in the kind of work happening to really break silos. And that's where I'd like to bring Sambhav in. Sambhav, your work with Land Conflict Watch is so fascinating, and I would like you to expand on that, of course, but would like to specifically ask you how you see the intersection between policy, history, and data collection as relevant to ensuring these safer futures that we talk about when we say resilience building for communities.
Yeah. Thanks, Anushka. No, I think after really inspiring talks by Gaganji and Manisha, it just helps me dive directly into the subject and experience that we had with Land Conflict Watch. Just a little context before I really answer your question. So, I'll start with why and how we started Land Conflict Watch. We see that in the context of polycrisis, I'll just try to place land in there. And we have just 2.4% of the land. India just have 2.4% of the land mass of the world, but it supports almost 18-19% of the world's population. At the same time, we are one of the fastest growing economies, which requires land and its resources to fuel that economic growth, right? Now, here, in a country like India, which has huge caste and class divide, right? And then at the same time, as Gaganji mentioned, we have been experiencing over the years a decay in democratic, equitable framework of governance, and that also eventually makes the governance systems inefficient. That is basically leading to more, dispossession of large sections of society from their rightful share of land and resources. And it's enmassing these resources in a few hands. Now, 400 million people in India actually directly depend on land and resources for livelihood, for food security, and for dignity. Like land is dignity for communities on the ground, not just economic livelihood and food security, of course. So in such a situation where when these crises of land and resources dispossession come, this is cascading into newer crises, as Manisha said, with increasing dispossession, these communities are further pushed to socio-economic margins. They become more and more vulnerable to emerging threats such as climate change, food and water shortage, disasters, pandemics, and not to forget human rights violations, because they don't have that kind of economic and social security without land and resources. So in such a such a situation, I think when these crises arise, the society and the governance system needs to efficiently respond to them. Now, they wouldn't unless they really understand this whole context, unless they understand this elephant in the room, that empowering communities, marginalized communities, is not just a top-down approach of empowering. I mean, education is important, health is important, all the other interventions are important, but something as intrinsic and as dependence on resources and land that they have been traditionally part of, they have been traditionally dependent on, unless that is addressed, it really doesn't efficiently address those stressors which are at the intersection of many things. So what we there was just a quick anecdote. I was working as a journalist. I've been working as a journalist in the past with one of the leading newspapers, and I would write on environmental issues, environmental conflicts, land issues. And one question I would always be sort of confronted with by editors is that, okay, one story about land issues in one corner of the country or environmental issues about one corner in the country, how much should we report? Why does it matter to say a readership in a city like Delhi, the English speaking readership? And I would be surprised that there would be very few people who would look at these issues as very much interlinked with the political economy of the country, that they are intersectional. They are not just about environment or forest or just about poverty. It's very much linked to all the crises that we are sort of facing today. And with that idea, I think, just to build that understanding, we started building Land Conflict Watch, which is a database of all the land conflicts happening across the country. Can you just go to the next slide? So these are basically, we've been building a map. We have been mapping these land conflicts. And next slide, please, Yasha.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this is stuck just a minute.
Not a problem. So what we try to do is we all these dots that you see, these are actually the cases of where instances of land and resources conflicts are happening. But conflict is just a term. It's just a lens where why we call it conflict, because we say that, okay, there are different contestants and there are different claims. And why we wanted to say is that you can't ignore communities' contentions, you can't ignore communities' demands, you can't ignore communities' concerns, and they are equal stakeholders in these contests, right? And that's why there are these contests, and you need to understand. So what we try to do is we started mapping these, and we started collecting data on each of these cases. That data will be on all kinds of sectors. It will be like economic data of how much investment is there, what kind of investment is there. There will be social data, there will be legal data of how courts are dealing with these issues, how courts are overwhelmed, and even how these contests are, because of these contests, even investments are suffering. The projects get delayed, cost escalations happen. And why this happens? Because at the beginning itself, the issues of equitable resource sharing, etc., is not addressed. So that doesn't bode well either for communities or for industries or for other sectors. And we really focus on data here of what really the community's demands are, what their contentions are, and all that is coded here. The idea was that when you address, when you design policies, when you design governance systems for better land governance, or to address or to find solutions of these kind of conflicts, it can't be top down. You have to develop. So we used a design thinking. We developed at this dashboard that is there on your screen. That I mean, today's policy in vogue. Dashboards are in vogue in policy making, right, and in governance systems, but they are all top down. We thought we'll develop a dashboard and a database which is bottom up, which is really ground up. It's created from ground, and then we talk about consultations from communities, with communities, when policy making is discussed. So it can't be just a formality in one instance where, okay, as a reaction to policy making, that, okay, you have to go and do and you have to consult communities. This database is actually a sort of a live tracker of what communities' contentions and demands are, and that if they are not consulted, then here is the information that you can see, and this should inform policy making, this should inform the governance. So that's where we came in from. in terms of building this sort of database and solution. And now then we work with lawyers, we work with journalists, we work with writers, we work with artists, we work with researchers to use this data to then sort of break down the issues that are really happening on the ground, and the concerns that are emerging from the ground, and figure out or suggest solutions for it. Can you go to the next slide, please? So as I was saying, the data, so over 100 parameters we collect data, and this is just one glimpse of how we collect data around communities' concerns and demands. So we really directly are in touch with communities and document their perspective on the issue. Next slide. And this is the kind of thing, kind of products that we come out with in using this data for guiding policy interventions, or even looking for solutions. And we have been tracking these cases of contest and conflicts, that how do they get resolved eventually, if there are solutions that actually work on the ground. And that kind of from that understanding of that data, we try to then also propose solutions, or at least suggest, come up with these solutions. At the same time, during this whole process, while we learn from communities what their perspective towards land and resources is, we also sort of try to work with them in this documentation and data collection from the ground up, which has been a huge learning exercise for us as well. And I'll stop there. I think there would be more in the discussion later.
Thank you, Sambhav. It's super fascinating and really great example to see how intersectoral and intersectional solution-oriented thinking this is, and really empowers community voices and links it to, like you said, what's normally top-down kind of policy thinking. That's very fascinating. I would like to now move to Nandini and bring Nandini in to, when we talk about the polycrisis, climate change is really at the heart of the issue and what causes sort of the accelerated pace of cascading crisis. So, Nandini would like to ask you how your research is being informed by ecological conservation and storytelling, and how is that relevant to creating inclusion and resilience within communities?
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Gaganji, for bringing up the point about partnerships of all goals. Manisha, for actually ensuring that people like us, wildlife scientists, and like us get a spot at the table. And I'm really grateful to Startup and the Aura Fellowship for giving me this a platform to be in a very diverse audience, a place which is very different from where I would usually be. So I thought actually that in this presentation, maybe I could take you all through a little story of this wax-eating bird. It's called the Yellow-Rumped Honey Guide. And this wax-eating bird was something that I found in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, which is in Arunachal Pradesh. And in terms of bird diversity, it has the second highest bird diversity in the world after the Andes Mountains. And the reason why this wax-eating bird is important, apart from its intrinsic and beautiful value that it has, is that to me, when I was doing this book called the Eagle Nest Memory Project, along with 108 other authors who were part of the Bukun, Shetukpen, and Nepali communities, I came across Mr. Chumbi Mekeji, this gentleman on the left here, who was one of the last honey collectors of his tribe. And with Chumbi Mekeji, because he was old and could no longer go into the forest, he started to tell me about this bird, and I started to observe this bird in much greater detail. And what I realized was that this bird is extremely unique because it has a kind of mutualism or a kind of relationship that we only know between dogs and humans, like how dogs and humans are beneficial to each other, or how dolphins and fishermen benefit each other. But this was a wonderful example that came from a 30-gram bird, which helps guide honey collectors to cliff edges. And in return, honey collectors keep a bit of wax for the bird after the honey is collected. And while this made it to the Eagle Nest Memory Project, and this project was released with people from the community. Can we go to the next slide? It also kind of reaffirmed what I have always believed in. And I've always kind of tried to figure out, where do I fit in? Something that Manisha also talked about. Am I somebody who also traverses history? Am I somebody who also traverses research? And so where do people like us fit in an institutional model that exists in India, that was formed in the 1960s, where neurobiologists are in a single lab, there wasn't concepts like you could be somebody working on the human dimensions of wildlife management, but this self-fashioning kind of journey reaffirmed what's my faith in something that all of you have also talked about how do you keep community at the center, and how do you form a net of mutuality around it. And so with my Aura Fellowship, what I've tried to do with the Canopy Collective is to try and create a model that focuses not on building a single NGO or a single institute, but how do you really think about organized citizenship behavior, where leadership is distributed among multiple people, where as scientists, we know a lot with respect to how climate change is affecting some of these places. Communities also live through that experience about how climate change is affecting some of the places that they live in. But what do we do about it? And can we create socially regenerative networks where our work is truly embedded in the site, and so are our partnerships? And so that was, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, and so this is the genesis of Canopy Collective, and another metaphor, which is our logo is going to be released, and our social media platforms are going to be released next week, is based on, again, another concept of cooperation called crown shyness, where if any of you like go into a forest, or if you're walking along any urban area, then you look up, you often notice that trees don't shade out each other. And there is crown shyness, where they ensure that they don't compete for light and allow each other to grow. So using this metaphor, can we go to the next slide? Similar to what was already talked about, how do we transform the field of nature conservation through ground-up partnerships, working not only with science, but how we think about science, art, and action, to think about the next generation of youth-led conservation leaders who are deeply embedded and invested in the aspect of ethical conservation, where it's not people versus animals or animal versus people, but it's humans and more than humans, and what are the frameworks we create around it. Can we go to the next slide? And so Canopy Collective as a physical space, we have got a physical space in the last 6 months, and this is a small snapshot of how quickly it has grown in terms of having a lot of young people from biodiversity management committees, to having young scientists who kind of feel bogged down by the institutional framework, saying that, hey, can we come together and think about work that can be done for some of the sites that we care about. And if we go to the next slide, will also just give you, this is my last slide, and this will just also give you a kind of example of the 4 projects that we have incubated on literally shoestring budgets, where there is on your left, if you look at it, there is the aspect of elephants walking through tea estates where they are recreationally chased. So how can people who watch around these elephants, how can tea estate managers, how can wildlife scientists, and how can children come together to know what is the kind of messaging that can reduce recreational chasing, and where is it that we have to place the right kind of messaging. These two projects, the diversity, equity, and inclusion for grassroots practitioners and the women folk storytellers project, have been incubated by crowdfunding that has been done by Shaituk, an illustrator who has been working with a sociologist. And there is also an example of the Biodiversity Management Committee of Nagaland, which has asked for educators to come and join them while they restore their forests, to create place-based education modules for children to understand what is it that happens when a forest grows back, and what does it sound like, and what does it feel like. And yeah, and that's all. I just thought I'd give you a glimpse of what a Canopy Collective is doing and what are some of the intrinsic values in terms of what it takes to get work done on the ground in terms of creating inclusive partnerships.
Thank you, Nandini. That was a fascinating example of, I mean, the way you showed that map of how cooperation networks can be built is really inspiring. And this is truly a way to look at systems thinking from a non-siloed approach. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would like now to bring Luis Miranda in and ask you a question. Louis, so as a philanthropist and a founder of institutions that really addresses these deep-rooted causes of inequality and systemic oppression, um, how do you think philanthropy can really prioritize communities in the polycrisis going forward?
Thanks, Anushka. I am a bit more positive than some of the others before me, but I think the points raised are so valid, and we still have a lot more work to do in this whole sector. That's why we have the journey, and that's why we have a civil society, because we need to keep the government and the corporate sector in check. I love the way Gagan started off with the Sita and Akbar story. I mean, that's a brilliant way to get the whole conversation started. We heard about the Aura fellowships with Manisha. We talked to her about land conflict issues with Sambhav. And it's interesting because I used to be in infrastructure. And there's so much of land acquisition issues which come about, and how do you handle the conflict between development and that? And of course, Nandini is a fabulous storyteller. And so it's been great. But to me, communities is key. And I've learned it over time through some of the organizations that I've been involved with. And everything is really about how do you understand the view of people from the grassroots, as opposed to someone sitting in some ivory tower determining what should everyone do here. And to me, this example came up with an organization which my wife is on the board of, 17,000 Feet Foundation. We worked for a long time in Ladakh. And then we moved to Sikkim, and we quickly realized that the problems in Sikkim schools is very different from the problems in Ladakh schools. And similarly, we work with Sunbird Trust, and the problems that schools have in Manipur is very different from the schools in Arunachal. So at Koro, an organization which I've been involved with, we learned so much about the fact that it's all about grassroots leadership development, and it's really the voice of the people down there. 70% of our fellows are from backward communities, marginalized communities, 70% are women. 40% have only been to secondary school. And I remember getting beaten up once when I used the word beneficiary, and I was told there are no beneficiaries. I think we're all partners together. And we started the Atadeep Academy, which is really about, a way to how do we take grassroots knowledge into the classroom, as opposed to the opposite, which happens. Like you're taking the classroom, the grassroots, how do we take grassroots knowledge into that? So that's clearly something which is important over here. And I also at the Indian School of Public Policy, which I co-founded, it's a lot about how do we keep design, when we look at design thinking of policy, How do we keep the citizen at the center of it? And all the work we do, the work that we work on, etc., is really looking at that part of it, keeping the citizen at the center when we look at any policy initiative as a friend. And that's how, the root cause. We've talked a little about collaboration also with each other, and and everyone talks about it. Everyone loves to talk about collaboration, but I think that's a challenge in every sort of sector that we're in, starting off with the civil society sector here. We talk about it, but and it always is a challenge later on, and it's possibly because lack of trust, because of uh, ego and the arrogance of people. It's the lack of being open-minded, and that ability to have dialogue is gone. So I think if we had a lot more dialogue and be people willing to share things up, we'll be able to sort of move more closely. And this again was given to me by a guy called Mahindra at Koro. Mahindra was a die-hard socialist. He's grown up over there. He hates anyone who's a capitalist. And he told me after, a few years ago when we got to spend time with each other, he said, Lewis, after seeing a lot of business people like you and others, I realized you guys aren't that bad. And that's so important. So if we had more avenues for dialogue, we'll be able to work a lot more closely. And even at ISPP, we're focusing on how do we work on Samaj Sarkar Bazaar, which are like, civil society, the government, and the private sector, to be able to build out capacity. And the last point I want to sort of leave behind is, when we look at all the work that we do, especially, and we talk about this polycrisis, we've got to ask ourselves, who is really benefiting from it? Is it the poor, or is it just the donors because they get all those awards, or the consultants because they get their fees, or the NGOs because they get their salaries? And that's the question to ask. Are we how much are we focusing on actual change over there? But I think, yes, I think it's a no-brainer if we believe that community should not be at the center of what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you all for sharing your points. We'll now shift focus to part 2 of this session. So here we really bring everyone together and move into a discussion around where civil society and philanthropy can step in to really impact change and build resilient futures in this polycrisis era. So just want to leave you all with this question. Where do we see civil society and philanthropy playing a greater role in fostering resilience? And where can we really connect these dots on really trying to shift systems? I now open the floor to all of you to have a discussion. Maybe Gaganji, you would like to start as well.
Okay, but it'd been Louis, I would just agree with what you said. I think you summed it up from a conceptual and a philosophical point of view so well. But for me, I worked with an organization in Rajasthan, and we were trying to help the tribal to articulate what is it that they want. And they articulated so simply. They just said, Sachi kheti, sacha bachpan, or sacha swaraj. That's all we want. And this word sacha is so true. I mean, there's a truth in it. And I think if we really want to look at it in another way, I want to go to that whole concept of Ubuntu, Ubuntu, the African, this thing. It really says, how can I be happy if everybody is sad? And therefore, the core is, I am because you are. Now, do we have, and that to me, I think, is where the bazaar has to start learning, and the sarkar has to start learning. And this, I must say, civil society, which has become NGOs, have to also start learning. Because this NGO business is, it tells you who you are not. It's not telling you who you are. I'm not government, which is crazy. I think we therefore need to rediscover our North Star. I think we need a rainbow coalition where identities are there. I mean, we can't be subservient to a whole corporate bug which is telling us Development is not about management. It's just management can be a supportive framework. It's a political process. I think we need to learn from animals now. I think, and Nandini and everybody telling us, please learn from animals. I mean, it's time we do that. But if I was to just say, we have to respect, and Louis, again, I bring to what you said, we have to build champions, I keep saying, leaders. We need to respect and not make our frontline workers into Zomato and Swiggy workers. I think civil society, NGOs have made them into Swiggy workers. Just going, collecting data, bringing it back. There's no reflective practice going on. We are just implementing. Is it our job to implement large-scale projects? We are supposed to solve the problem of the country. Why this thing? So such beautiful things like what Nandini brings or, Manisha is talking of, we can build practice, and that practice has to then be built with partnership and policy. I think that's the roadmap to go. And therefore, all I'm saying is there will be polarity. And I was just, if I read this, not an outsider throwing rocks, nor a comfortable insider who defends the status quo, but one who lives precariously with two perspectives held tightly together, the faithful insider and the critical outsider at the same time. Not ensconced safely inside, but not so far outside as to lose compassion and understanding. This, to me, is the role of philanthropy. And lastly, I think as civil society, we have to live on the edge of insight, which is when you have learned the rules well enough to know how to break the rules properly, which is not really to break them at all, but to find their true purpose, Kumar. The FRA or whatever it is, they need to find their true purpose. We have the laws, but we have to break them in the mind, the mental model of how it's constructed, and not to abolish the law, but to complete it. Thus, we are not content to be mere critics as civil society from the outside, but to strive to be those who can bring about real change through constructive, critical engagement with those in power. Are they willing to listen to us? They will not listen to NGOs. They will listen to communities. They will come down on their knees, as it is happening in Delhi, if they don't listen to communities. I think that's the roadmap. I keep saying invest there, invest in people, invest in human resources, and don't invest in big dams and megalomaniac kind of, I want to work in 10,000 villages and 20,000 villages, and it's crazy. So respecting what all you people are doing so beautiful, I think if we can all build a rainbow coalition, is what I keep saying, learning from each other, building that trust, as Louis was also saying. And that to me is really the creative tension which we need to build. Yeah, I'll stop here. Maybe I've spoken too much, but to me, this passion is what is so important to build. Yeah, but anybody else?
So I'm going to jump in then. So there's a Gangan hearing you. I realize that it's been a long time since we talked. We need to catch up again. So I'm going to reach out to you soon after this. We need to catch up. And I think just to add on over here to what you said so well is the ability to listen. We've we hear, but I don't think we listen. And it's and that's something which is important. What are people saying? What are the voices of the community saying that's so important? Our son, who sort of thinks sometimes that I'm pretty useless, works with the Inuit in the Arctic Circle, and again he talks about how do you learn from the people, the indigenous people, and their habits, etc. Now, yes, there is a conflict because the world has also become a lot more urbanized and developed, and some of the things may not be valid today. But to just dismiss them totally is wrong. And I've learned this again at Koro through our son and through other experiences, that if we just sort of were open-minded to some of the points of others and listen to them, we can have less problems.
Right. So I'd just like to build on that and just share a couple of things. So one, to resonate, Gaganbhai, with what you said, and to your question, Anushka, what can be done differently? I think, first of all, we imagine a scenario where the next session on polycrisis does not have us, but it has the community historians, the community forest historians, the community storytellers, the new knowledge makers. They should be here in these discussions. And how many more years are we going to wait for that to happen is really critical. I mean, that's the central question, right? I know, Kumar, you want to jump in, but Luis, one thing that I have learned is that, I mean, as an NGO sector, we have really done a lot of listening. We've spent a lot of time learning to listen. But now we need to do two things. We need to do this listening a bit differently. We need to sort of really build systems and platforms where government systems, mainstream systems, business institutions can listen and respond to communities. There has to be that, we can no longer be the wire media. We can just be, the platform builders, the channel creators. So listening now has to be done, differently. So those are the two things. And in terms of really data, we kind of understand data very differently. Now, if government has to respond to, community resilience or even acknowledge it, then, community has its data. I mean, if you equip communities on the ground, we are part of a program with one of our Aura India advisors called Cities for Youth, where in peri-urban areas, young women are actually doing audits to really assess how cities can be gender responsive, because it's no longer their problem that they are not being able to go to work. It's just that city systems are not responding. So how do we really work towards citizen data? And for that, we also need new players in the sector. The unusual have to really become the mainstream. The players on the margin have to become now mainstream. Who kind of shape new collaboratives. So I just want to say that. I know, Kumar, you wanted to come in.
No, thank you, everyone. I think I just couple of points I wanted to add to or maybe respond what Gaganji said. And also what Luis said. So, I mean, just from one instance, one data point that we have that shows that over 30 lakh crore of worth of investments are actually stuck in land conflicts when we are looking at. And that just boils down to one simple reason. I mean, it's not simple, it's complicated enough, and these issues are complex enough. But the fact is that in the beginning itself, you don't listen to communities and the concerns that that they would raise on the ground. Gaganji mentioned Forest Rights Act. There are laws in place, but often in practice, they are because of this I think feudal mindset or just this top-down approach that you can think that you can roughshod over communities' voices and demands. You can sort of make things happen quicker or earlier, but that really doesn't happen. These conflicts, your projects get stuck, cost escalation happens. So that's one side of the view. The other side is that this doesn't happen because even if, say, some players in the game are not recognizing communities' voices or they're not acknowledging it, communities are very, very well aware of what their entitlements and rights are. They believe in that. So if conflicts are not happening in courts, they would happen on the ground, like what we are seeing right now. So if there is like the legal systems do not address, it will still play out on the ground. and that doesn't help anyone. Neither side it helps. So I think those that kind of understanding we could build from by interacting with communities and really looking into the data. So that was and I do feel that there are the few people who we find conducive to have this kind of conversation with, even in the civil society. Like you were mentioning that maybe there's a different way of understanding, there's lack of understanding of this kind of solutions, or this kind of approach towards work, and which we often face in our work. So I think that's something also to think to ponder about, how within civil society and philanthropic ecosystem there could be more players who are conducive to working together on similar sort of solutions and platforms. I'll stop there. Maybe Nandini would like to come in.
I just have one short point to add here, where I also think it's very important for us to kind of return to the idea of cooperative pedagogy, where how we think about really distributing power, knowledge, and focus equitably, and also building that sense of beauty in the world, in these processes that we create. Because I also think when there is a value in motion and getting things going, there's also a value in process, which we often fail to see when we do these things. So I think that was one point I had.
Can I just add one point, what you said, Nandini? The whole nation was designed on cooperative federalism. We have shifted to competitive federalism, which means those who have done well will be given more. And that's what even philanthropy is trying to do. Instead of supporting those who are struggling with the difficult, you start supporting those who are succeeding. Now, this is a mindset where business has taken over governance. And the triad is therefore not working.
Thank you all speakers. I think now our audience is eager with a few questions. So we will invite some questions which I think have come in through the chat box. Yeah. Yeah, so I think we have one question around how does building community resilience or ground champions work under the current CSR laws? Would anybody respond to that?
So we had to sort of really respond to that question when we were designing the Aura Fellowship.
Manisha, I guess you're saying something.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So we had to actually, thank you for that question, because we had to respond to that question when we were designing the Aura India Fellowship. And we've had many conversations with the Aura India Fellows around, how CSR norms work. The simple answer to that question is that building community resilience does not always work in great rhythm and tandem with CSR laws. And, because the time scales of community resilience and the process of community resilience building is not 1 year at a time. It's not, there are many processes that need to work out towards citizenship building, towards collaboration, towards building personhood of, within communities, which really sort of, don't, will not, we all know this, will not sort of lead to smart measurables like outputs and outcomes. And building community resilience also requires, our friends, partners to be on the ground. So, folks who are also designing CSR programs really need to be hyper-local. They really need to be on the ground. So I think some of those norm shifts, need to happen. They may or may not happen within the framework of CSR. So, but there are many creative avenues, as Luis said, he's optimistic. We have actually found the whole process of fellowships, which are short-term investments. We've also seen community resilience. Communities don't sort of say, give us 10 crores for this. They don't say, give us 10 lakhs, right? They sort of really recognize a small an input and say, okay, we are going to sort of really see what we can do with this, because we have community resources that we can build in. So less time-bound giving, more open, sort of, less structured giving is what's really going to lead to community resilience. I don't know if anyone has to say, yeah.
Could I jump in over here? So
Okay, great.
Manisha.
Thanks, Manisha, for that. So the previous question was from Agam Shah, and we have one more question from Meenu. Is polycrisis a new term for something that has been happening a long time, or is it indicative of a new form of crisis? I suspect the former, but if it's the latter, I would like to know more. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Could I just go back to the previous question on funding it? And I go back to Manisha's point about fellowships. Fellowships is one way to fund basic community work. So at Coro, for example, we do have CSR money coming in over here for fellowship work, which help build out the community leadership over there. And so that's one way which works, as well as also looking at projects which could be at the community level. The challenge is coming up with metrics which can be short term, which sort of move on to more of a long term thing. So I just wanted to add that point over there. Come back to sorry, there's other questions.
I think, would anyone else like to respond to the question as well?
I just want to say what I spoke earlier. We, in the name of accountability, which is important, we are, what I keep saying, Swiggyizing and Zomatoizing the whole frontline fellowship support system. You want them to give a monthly report where they went. They want to calculate their time, which bus ticket you want to put. There are actually many of the CSRs put the bus tickets and attach it. I mean, then the person is all they're doing is when they go to and then what did they do in the village? Write the report. I think this is killing the spirit. Trust, otherwise go back home. You do all your due diligence to decide you want to trust or you don't want to trust. But once you trust, then engage, come, be. And there are many CSR who will come and spend time, learn. I keep asking my CSR friends, they were all, 90% of them went from the NGO sector there, not from civil society. If they were civil society, they would not have gone. They went from the NGOs there. I'm asking them, if you had the solution, why don't you do it? Why don't you come and finish it off? Why do you want me to be your subcontractor to do things which you think sitting in a boardroom, you know how to do, spend your money? Or you want a partnership where you are also willing to learn, because I'm also learning. I need to only tell my success stories, but I want to talk about where I failed. That's the fellowship culture that we are talking of.
And just to Meenu's question, Meenu, your question is just spot on. Polycrisis as a phenomenon has been building up, for a very long time. But I think the word has come to light now, and it's gained vocabulary now because the intersectionality has started to now, the stresses have started from all kinds of spaces and locations started to impact communities, started to impact civil society at such levels that the term polycrisis is now giving us perhaps just a new, as I said, a vocabulary or a grammar to understand that 2 + 2 is no longer 4. It's something else altogether. And if we have to solve, if communities have to solve their crises, we really need to shift our lens and focus on structures, because women are saying it's not that we are not in the workforce. Data isn't capturing our work. Women are saying, if you really want us to, for us to really kind of take over, to really earn and work productively, don't pump us up anymore with skills. Forget your skill building, but start to look at how cities can be more gender responsive. So that shift, I think just the term polycrisis is a little bit of a trigger to get us to say enough of skilling, educating communities. They really are the experts. We really need to now start to work with systems and like Louis said, build mechanisms for them to hear and respond to communities. So I think it's just that shift.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Manisha. I think in the interest of time, we'll take one last question, and we have one from Andrea Frey. The question is, you all spoke about the need to listen, which will allow us to respond to the real needs. Aura focuses strongly on shaping narratives, focusing on storytelling. Where does narrative building and storytelling enhance our ability to listen?
Can I comment on that? Yeah, sorry, that's just my favorite, I think, area to respond to on storytelling. I think it was really just coming from experience of dealing with different kind of. I narrated that one anecdote of telling the story to my editor itself, right? And then they would understand the language of data. They would understand the language of money when you're talking about community. So I think from that perspective, when we are telling policymakers, we're telling the editors, looking at the intersection of politics and business, it was really important to bring and make the community's voices and complement with data and more evidence, so that there is more people, I mean, that side of the spectrum, listen to these stories. And then at the same time, when we are communicating to communities, it was important to also break down the processes of governance, how really the land governance work, how the bureaucracy work, and then breaking that down into a storytelling. That was, I think, really important. How do you access documents from the system? How do you understand those documents? How do you break that down to understand and then respond to this process? At the same time, I mean, the whole new generation of social media, arts, storytellers, and we had to figure out how do you tell these complex stories of land at the intersection of governance and these processes through very simple nuggets of storytelling through social media, an Instagram post or a multimedia post, and we broke that down. So we keep saying internally in our team that, okay, journalism, if we had to practice, we should be practicing it like how researchers do. And if you have to practice research, we should be practicing how storytellers and journalists do. And that's when you bring everyone together to listen and to understand what really the issues matter. And that was, I think, my biggest learning also from the Aura Fellowship, that we were interacting with storytellers like Nandini within the cohort and other people who practice art, that it's just the same issue, but you can communicate in different ways to different audience. And that's really at the core of addressing an issue and bringing more people into the fold, making them the stakeholder in addressing the issue.
Could I jump in? Nandini, do you want to go on? Why don't you go ahead first? You're the storyteller.
Well, I just had another small point to add about the ability to listen and how storytelling can enhance that. But I'd also like to push that a bit ahead in terms of storytelling enhancing the ability to also just be. And Actually, one of my favorite pieces of writing comes from Robin Wall Kimmerer of Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about if you are a human and you meet a bay, right? And a bay is expansive, and how do you hold space within that bay? Hold space for stories, hold space for conflict. And I think that ability of being in the natural world, where it inspires a level of storytelling, embodies a level of practice that is really, really reflective, which I wish actually more people would be able to access it in a simpler and easier way.
Louis, before you come in, if I can, I think what Nandini is saying, we try to capture it in through what I call people's museums. We have two. We call them the conflictoriums, one in Ahmedabad and one in Raipur. And the whole idea really is that conflict is to be embraced, and you can bring voices of communities and people through their own cultural narratives and embrace conflict and not violence. And I think we try to run away from conflict but become violent. So I think this is so important that people's conflicts have voice and their stories we give them space in cities, in rural areas. Sorry, Louis, you wanted to say something?
No, carry on.
Go ahead.
No. Okay, you finished? Are you done?
Yeah, no, I'm done.
Okay. No, I just want to add three things. One is, at ISPP, one of the things that we do is really helping people. How do you draft a memo? You've got to capture the attendance of someone in a limited set of words so that because otherwise you just lose the person's attention. That's the first thing. At Coro also, we talk a lot about stories of our communities, etc. And then we had Dalbert come in and did a brilliant work for us on basically articulating those stories in a more interesting manner. And finally, the one who is one of my favorite storytellers is a lady called Safina Hussain, who started Educate Girls. And she tells us, she basically just talks stories like also, with Teach for India. And she talks about, and she ends up every story with her saying, I am Safina Hussain, I educate girls. And it just sort of wraps the whole thing around.
Thank you so much, panelists. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, that's all the questions we can take today. I'd now like to ask Tiyasha to give us a glimpse on the Dasra report on polycrisis that is supported by the Omega Resilience Award. And this is before we close for the day. Over to you, Tiyasha.
Thank you. Thank you, Anushka. And thank you to all our speakers for that powerful and very thought-provoking panel discussion. Good evening. I'm Tiyasha Sengupta from the Catalytic Philanthropy team at Dasra. I'm here today to briefly take you through Dasra's journey of researching on the polycrisis and philanthropy in India, undertaken as part of the Omega Resilience Awards. My aim is to highlight some of our key findings that particularly speak to the philanthropy sector as a key stakeholder in driving meaningful and catalytic impact. Dasra conducted a year-long study to understand the philanthropic sector's engagement and its potential in addressing the polycrisis from the perspective of India. Our focus was on examining its implications and emphasizing the need for building community resilience by bringing to light ground-up insights and influencing philanthropic action. The report further leverages social sector knowledge by examining the giving journeys of leaders in this space, showcasing good practices and narratives through insightful case studies to look at trends and reflect upon what catalytic philanthropy means for social impact. Our key findings show that to respond to the polycrisis in India, there is a need to shift power dynamics towards equity by subverting the top-bottom approach to solutioning for communities and strengthening collaborations across sectors and levels, promoting inclusive decision-making and amplifying marginalized voices. Our research also emphasized the criticality of exhibiting catalytic giving through long-term unrestricted funding, enabling organizations to innovate and address root causes, fostering resilience. Another key aspect of our research highlighted the importance of building community-centric programs by supporting local leadership and decentralized decision making, ensuring alignment with community needs, promoting ownership and responsiveness to local contexts. Our report also accentuates embracing failure as a means to foster innovation and resilience through experimentation. This approach acknowledges the inherent unpredictability of philanthropic work and paves the way for adaptive strategies that can lead to measurable outcomes. Lastly, our study draws attention to developing and strengthening civil society institutions through proactive capacity building aimed at enhancing the agility and resilience of organizations, enabling effective responses to ongoing and emerging crises through resources, training, and strategic support. Drawing together these giving behaviors, our research emphasizes the indispensable role of philanthropy in addressing India's intricate challenges. Through collaborative, catalytic, and community centered approaches, and by nurturing resilience, philanthropy can serve as a cornerstone in fostering sustainable solutions and cultivating a society that is more equitable and resilient. The report will launch in the first week of April. Please stay tuned to Dasra's social media accounts for more. Thank you. Thanks so much, Tiyasha, for sharing more about the Dasra report on polycrisis and philanthropy. We're eager to release the report soon, and we really hope that it benefits further collaboration and inspires a push towards catalytic funding for social impact. And with that, we are at a close. Before we end this session, I would like to thank each of our panelists for taking the time out and sharing their insights with us today. It's been really fascinating and delightful to hear from each of you and your deep knowledge from the sector. And thank you for all that you do. I would also like to thank our session partner, Startup, for their support and collaboration in creating this session. Thank you, Manisha. And Omega Resilience Award, Andrea, Susan, and Mark, for founding and supporting the upcoming Dasra research report on the polycrisis. I would also like to thank the Dasra tech support team, Sagar and Daigo, who are pillars of dependability here at the Dasra office, and Mahima Sharda, who has volunteered to support us with this session. Lastly, our wonderful audience for taking the time out this evening to tune into this discussion. We hope that this was helpful and insightful in shaping how we think about India and resilience building in an era of the polycrisis. Thank you all so much and good night.
And thank you, Anushka, for holding space so
Everyone,
beautifully.
we do have a feedback poll, so request you all to please fill that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, speakers. If you would like to drop off your free to this. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Have a
much.
good night, everyone.
Feedback looks good. Thank you.